There is a quiet question that seems to follow human thought across time itself. It does not arrive loudly or demand attention, yet it remains present like a soft echo in the background of awareness. Where did we truly begin, and why does that beginning feel just out of reach? For most of history, the answer has been offered in simple terms: evolution, adaptation, survival. And yet, even within those explanations, something remains unresolved, a subtle sense that the story might be incomplete. Not wrong, but unfinished. There are moments, usually in quiet hours, when the mind slows and the world softens, when this question returns with a different weight. What if humanity was not simply the result of blind processes, but part of something intentional? Not created in the way stories often describe, but guided, shaped, or influenced in ways that have since been forgotten. This idea does not need to be proven to be felt. It lingers in the gaps between what is known and what is assumed. Ancient civilizations left behind traces of thought that seem to circle this same possibility, though they spoke in symbols and stories rather than clear explanations. Across different lands and distant cultures, there are similar patterns, beings from above figures who shaped human existence and then faded into myth. It is easy to dismiss such ideas as imagination, yet the consistency of these themes raises a gentler question. What if memory can exist without clarity? What if something once known has been carried forward only as fragments? The mind does not need to accept this possibility to explore it. It only needs to remain open long enough to notice how naturally the question returns. And perhaps that is where this journey begins, not with answers, but with a feeling that something about our origin is still waiting to be understood. So we pause here without conclusion, allowing the thought to settle instead of forcing it forward. In that stillness, the question does not fade. It deepens, becoming less about finding an immediate answer and more about recognizing its quiet persistence. Something within human awareness seems to lean toward this idea, as if part of the story has always been waiting just beneath the surface of what we believe to be complete. And in that space, the unknown quietly remains alive within us all. As the question lingers, it begins to reach backward, beyond the present, beyond recorded memory, into the earliest moments where human thought first took shape in language and symbol. Long before modern explanations, before structured science and defined timelines, there were stories. Not casual inventions, but carefully preserved narratives repeated across generations as if they carried something more than imagination. In the valleys of ancient Mesopotamia, the earliest known civilization spoke of beings who existed before humanity, shaping order from chaos. Along the banks of the Nile, Egyptian traditions describe divine figures who brought knowledge, structure, and life itself. Across distant continents separated by oceans and time, similar ideas emerged again and again. Figures from above, creators who were not entirely human, guides who appeared at the beginning and then withdrew. The details differed, the names changed, but the pattern remained quietly consistent. It is not the stories themselves that draw attention, but their repetition across cultures that had no known contact with one another. Civilizations that rose independently, yet carried echoes of the same origin idea. This repetition does not confirm anything on its own, yet it introduces a subtle tension. Why would separate societies imagine such similar beginnings? One possibility is coincidence, the natural tendency of human minds to create meaning. Another possibility, less certain, yet harder to dismiss completely, is that these stories may not have been created from nothing. They may have been remembered. Not in precise detail, not in clear language, but in fragments shaped by time, translated through generations until they became myth. If that were the case, well then these ancient whispers are not simply stories, they are distorted reflections of something that once felt real enough to preserve. And so the question shifts slightly. Not just where did we come from, but what did the earliest humans believe they witnessed? Somewhere beneath civilization, beneath language and structure, those early beliefs still remain, quietly influencing how humanity continues to wonder about its own beginning. As the echoes of ancient stories begin to settle, the search for something more tangible naturally follows. Not just stories passed through memory, but physical traces left behind, quiet and enduring. In the region once known as Sumer, something remarkable was preserved. Not through oral tradition alone, but through marks pressed carefully into clay. These were not random symbols or decorative patterns. They formed one of the earliest known writing systems, a structured method of recording thought, events, and understanding. Cuneiform. Each tablet carried impressions that survived long after the voices that created them had faded. Unlike stories that shift over time, these tablets remained unchanged, holding their original form with silent precision. What they contain is not always clear in meaning, yet their existence alone changes the nature of the question. These were not myths spoken loosely around firelight. They were records, deliberately inscribed, meant to endure. Among these inscriptions are references to beings, events, and origins that mirror the patterns seen across other civilizations. Figures described with authority, actions that suggest involvement in shaping the world, and accounts that move beyond simple storytelling. And still, they do not present themselves as direct explanations. They are fragmented, incomplete, and often difficult to interpret with certainty. Parts are missing, translations vary, and context is not always preserved. And yet, that incompleteness creates a different kind of intrigue. If these tablets are only fragments, then what is missing may be just as important as what remains. They do not offer clear answers, but they resist being dismissed entirely. Their structure, their intent, and their persistence suggest that they were created to document something considered important at the time, something worth recording permanently. So the perspective begins to shift once more. These ancient accounts are no longer just distant myths. They become artifacts, physical traces of early human attempts to capture their understanding of existence. Whether that understanding was accurate or symbolic remains uncertain, but the fact that it was written, preserved, and rediscovered invites a quieter, more focused question. Not simply what do these tablets say, but why did those who created them feel the need to say it at all? From within these tablets, a presence begins to take shape. Not fully defined, not explained in a way that removes all doubt, but mentioned often enough to stand apart from everything else. The Anunnaki. The name appears in ancient Mesopotamian records, not as a single figure, but as a group. They are described as beings connected to the earlier structures of existence, associated with authority, order, and influence over the world as it was understood at the time. They are not introduced as distant or abstract forces. Instead, they are placed within the narrative of creation itself, interacting with both the environment and, in some interpretations, with humanity. Yet the descriptions are not uniform. Some texts suggest roles tied to governance or oversight, while others imply involvement in shaping or guiding life. There are moments where they seem elevated beyond human reach, and others where their presence feels closer, almost tangible. This variation does not provide clarity, but it does create depth. Rather than presenting a single fixed image, the Anunnaki appear as a layered concept, shifting slightly depending on the source, yet always maintaining a position of significance. What stands out is not what is fully explained, but what is consistently implied. They were present at the beginning, they held influence, and they were remembered. Beyond that, the details begin to blur, leaving space for interpretation rather than conclusion. This is where the idea settles, not as a defined truth, but as a quiet introduction. The Anunnaki are not yet understood, not yet placed into a clear framework. They simply exist within the earliest recorded attempts to explain the world, and for now, that is enough. A name, a presence, and a role that remains just beyond full comprehension, waiting to be explored further as the story continues to unfold. Before written records, Before cities took shape and histories were carved into stone, there was a span of time that exists almost entirely in silence. It stretches far beyond the boundaries of what is commonly remembered, a vast period where human presence was real yet largely unrecorded. This is where the edges of certainty begin to soften. Now, modern understanding offers timelines, estimates, and reconstructions, but even these are built upon fragments. Tools, bones, traces of fire, and scattered remains form the foundation of what is believed. Yet between these fragments lie immense gaps, spaces where no clear narrative exists. What happened during those missing moments is not fully known. And it is within these gaps that the imagination does not need to invent, but simply to wonder. If early humanity existed long before structured civilization, then their experiences, their encounters, and their understanding of the world may have unfolded in ways that left little trace behind, not because nothing occurred, but because what did occur was never recorded in a way that could survive. Or perhaps it was recorded and simply lost. Entire landscapes have shifted over time. Rivers have changed course, oceans have risen, and regions that once supported life now lie buried beneath layers of earth and water. What was once visible may now be hidden, not erased, but waiting beyond reach. This introduces a quieter possibility. That history, as it is currently understood, may not be incomplete because it is wrong, but because it is partial, a surface layer. Beneath it, there may exist earlier chapters, deeper timelines, and events that shaped the direction of humanity before the first known civilizations ever emerged. The mind does not need to accept this as fact. It only needs to recognize how much remains unknown. And in that recognition, the perspective begins to widen. Instead of viewing history as a fixed sequence of events, it becomes something more fluid, a collection of discoveries that continue to expand, or revealing more questions as each answer is found. So the world before recorded time remains quiet, not because nothing happened, but because whatever did happen has yet to fully reveal itself. And perhaps that silence is not empty, but filled with stories that have simply not been heard yet. As the silence of early time lingers, another idea begins to form, not as a conclusion, but as a possibility that appears repeatedly within ancient accounts. The idea of arrival, not gradual development, not emergence from within, but the presence of something that came from beyond what was already here. In several early traditions, there are references to beings descending, appearing, or entering the world at a point when humanity was still in its earlier stages. These descriptions are not always direct, and they are often shaped through symbolic language, yet they carry a consistent underlying structure. Something came, something arrived, and its presence altered the course of what followed. The nature of this arrival is not described in terms that align with modern understanding. There are no clear explanations, no detailed mechanisms. Instead, there are images of descent from the sky, emergence from the heavens, or movement between realms that are not fully defined. To interpret these descriptions literally may be too simple, yet to dismiss them entirely may overlook their persistence. What matters is not how these accounts are understood, but that they exist across multiple sources, each offering a slightly different reflection of the same idea, an interruption in the natural flow, a moment where something external entered into the human story. This does not confirm the nature of what arrived, nor does it explain its origin. It simply introduces the possibility that humanity's path was not entirely isolated, that at some point there may have been contact, influence, or observation from something beyond early human awareness. Whether this was perceived accurately or interpreted through limited understanding remains uncertain. But the repetition of this narrative suggests that the idea of arrival was not incidental. It was important enough to be remembered, even if the details could not be preserved clearly. And so the thought settles gently into place, not as an answer, but as a shift. From a closed system to an open one, from a self-contained origin to a possibility of interaction. And once that possibility is allowed, even briefly, the question of where humanity came from becomes more complex, more layered, and far less settled than it first appeared. As the idea of arrival settles into place, another layer begins to emerge, quieter, more deliberate, and shaped not by presence alone, but by purpose. If something arrived, then the question naturally follows, why here? Ancient accounts do not always provide direct answers, yet within some interpretations there are subtle suggestions that the earth itself held value beyond being a place of habitation, not as a home in the human sense, but as something to be used, accessed, or engaged with for a specific reason. In certain readings of early records, the environment is described not only as a setting, but as a source. Materials, elements, and resources appear within these narratives in ways that feel intentional, as though they were the focus rather than the background. This introduces a different perspective, that the presence of these beings, whatever their nature, may not have been centered on humanity at first, but on the world itself. The land, the minerals, the structure of the planet. Humanity in this context becomes something secondary, not the original purpose, but a development that emerged within that purpose. This idea does not need to be accepted fully to be considered. It simply shifts the focus from creation as an act of meaning to creation as part of a process. If the earth was seen as valuable, then interaction with it would follow. And if that interaction required effort, organization, or adaptation, then the emergence of a workforce, a system, or a supportive structure would begin to make sense within that framework. This is where the narrative begins to overlap with earlier questions. Was humanity shaped to fit a need? Or did humanity evolve alongside that need, influenced by it in ways that are no longer clearly visible? There is no single answer preserved in these fragments, only suggestions, scattered across time, pointing toward a possibility that feels both distant and strangely familiar. That the world we experience as home may have once been seen differently. Not as a place of belonging, but as a place of purpose. And within that purpose, humanity may have found its beginning, not as the centre of the story, but as part of something larger that has yet to be fully understood. If the world was not viewed as a home in the way humans understand it, and if presence came with purpose, then another possibility begins to take form, one that moves closer to the human experience itself, not just arrival, not just intention, but interaction. Within ancient accounts, there are moments where the distance between these beings and early humans appears to narrow. The descriptions are not always direct, yet they carry a sense of proximity, as though something more than observation was taking place. Figures are described not only as distant creators, but as participants. They speak, they act, they influence outcomes. In some interpretations, they are seen guiding, instructing, or even shaping early human development in ways that suggest more than passive existence. These encounters are not presented in a single consistent form. Some are symbolic, layered with meaning that is difficult to separate from imagination. Others feel more grounded, describing actions and events with a sense of familiarity that suggests they were meant to be understood, even if only partially. What remains consistent is the idea of contact, not constant, not fully explained, but present enough to leave an impression. For early humans, such encounters would not have been interpreted through modern frameworks. There were no concepts of advanced systems or external origins. What they experienced would have been understood through the language and awareness available to them at the time, and so, what may have been interaction became story. What may have been influence became myth. This does not diminish the possibility of those encounters. It simply shows how they may have been preserved, filtered through perception, shaped by time, and carried forward as fragments of something that once felt immediate. If these interactions occurred, even briefly, they would have left more than physical impact. They would have shaped belief, structure, and the earliest forms of understanding about existence itself. and perhaps that influence did not disappear. Perhaps it became embedded, woven quietly into the development of human thought, guiding it in ways that are no longer recognized as external. So the narrative continues to unfold, not with certainty, but with a growing sense that humanity's earliest moments may have included something more than isolation, something observed, something shared, something remembered, even if only in pieces. As the idea of interaction begins to settle, the narrative shifts once more, moving from presence and contact towards something more specific, a need. In several ancient accounts, there are subtle references to effort, burden, and work. Not human work as it is understood today, but something larger, something tied to maintaining or extracting from the world itself. These descriptions do not always stand out clearly, yet when viewed together, they begin to form a pattern. There was a task, and that task required more than what was already available. Within certain interpretations, the beings associated with early creation are not portrayed as effortless or detached. Instead, there are moments where they appear engaged in activity that demands energy, organization, and continuity. This introduces a different perspective, one where existence itself is not static, but requires maintenance. If that were the case, then the concept of labour begins to take shape, not as punishment, not as consequence, but as necessity. And within that necessity, a question emerges naturally. Who performs the work? If the burden was too great or too inefficient to sustain, then a solution would eventually be required. Not immediately, not suddenly, but as a gradual response to a growing imbalance. This is where the idea of creation begins to shift from abstract origin to functional purpose. Rather than asking why humanity exists in a philosophical sense, the focus turns toward how humanity might fit into a system that required participation. If early beings sought to reduce their own effort, or to distribute it more effectively, then the emergence of a supporting presence becomes easier to imagine, not as an act of generosity, but as an act of design. This does not imply certainty. It simply aligns with the pattern suggested within ancient fragments. A need identified, a solution formed, and within that solution, the earliest version of humanity may have taken shape, not fully as it is known today, but as something closer to a beginning. This idea does not resolve the mystery, it deepens it. Because if humanity was created or shaped to fulfill a role, then that role may still echo in ways that are no longer clearly visible. And perhaps the question is no longer just where we came from, but what we were meant to become within a system that may have existed long before we understood it. As the possibility of purpose begins to take shape, another layer emerges, one that moves from intention into method. If humanity was not entirely accidental, then how could such a transition occur? Ancient accounts do not describe processes in the way modern science would expect. There are no clear explanations of mechanisms or detailed steps that align with current understanding. Instead, there are symbolic descriptions, references to shaping, forming, combining, and bringing life into existence through deliberate action. These descriptions, though abstract, point toward an idea that feels more structured than simple emergence. Something was altered. Something was combined. Within certain interpretations, there are suggestions that early humans were not created from nothing, but developed through interaction with what already existed. This introduces the concept of modification rather than pure creation, not replacing nature, but intervening within it. The idea of combining elements, of merging forms or essence, appears in multiple variations. While the language is often symbolic, it reflects an attempt to describe a process that may have been beyond the understanding of those recording it. From a modern perspective, this begins to resemble something close to intervention at a fundamental level, not through tools or visible construction, but through manipulation of what defines life itself, the structure of being. This does not require certainty to be considered. It only requires recognition that ancient descriptions, though limited in clarity, may have been attempts to explain something that could not be fully understood at the time. If early humans were shaped through such intervention, then their existence becomes something more complex than a gradual, isolated development. They become a result of influence layered onto nature, and neither entirely separate from the earth nor entirely independent within it. This idea does not deny natural processes. Instead, it introduces the possibility that those processes may have been guided, adjusted, or accelerated. Not in a way that leaves obvious evidence, but in a way that aligns with the fragments preserved in ancient records, and so the narrative continues to expand, from purpose to process, from presence to participation, leaving behind a quiet but persistent thought that what humanity is today may not be solely the result of what occurred naturally, but also of what may have been intentionally shaped along the way. As the idea of intervention begins to settle, the perspective shifts again, moving beyond how humanity may have been shaped toward what that shaping might imply. If there was influence, if there was adjustment, then what emerged was not random in the purest sense. It carried direction. Humanity, as it exists, is marked by qualities that extend beyond simple survival. The ability to reflect, to question, to imagine what does not yet exist. These are not necessary for basic existence, yet they define the human experience. This introduces a subtle tension. Why would a being shaped only for function possess such depth of awareness? The mind does not only respond to the environment, it observes itself. It searches for meaning even when none is required for survival. It creates systems, symbols, and ideas that extend far beyond immediate necessity. This suggests that if humanity was shaped, it may not have been shaped for a single purpose alone. There is complexity within the design, adaptability, intelligence. Emotional range and self-awareness all exist together, forming a structure that is both functional and deeply reflective. This combination does not resolve easily into a simple explanation. It invites reconsideration. Perhaps humanity was not designed for one role, but for multiple layers of existence, a surface function that is visible, and a deeper capacity that continues to unfold over time. If that were the case, then what appears as contradiction may actually be intention. The need to work, to survive, to exist within systems, alongside the ability to question those systems, to move beyond them, to redefine them. This duality becomes difficult to ignore. It suggests that humanity is not fixed but dynamic, not complete, but evolving within a framework that may have been initiated rather than finished. And within that framework, the question of origin begins to blend with the question of direction. Not only where did humanity come from, but what was it meant to become? If there was design, then there may also be progression, something that continues to develop long after the initial shaping occurred. And perhaps that is why the sense of incompleteness remains, not as a flaw, but as part of the structure itself, a reminder that whatever humanity is, it may still be in the process of becoming something more. As the idea of design begins to settle into place, attention turns towards something less visible, yet more defining than any physical trait. Consciousness. It is easy to focus on the body, on structure, on the measurable aspects of existence. But what separates humanity most clearly is not form, but awareness, the ability to experience, to reflect, yet to recognize existence itself. This is where the question deepens. If humanity was shaped or guided in any way, then why include this level of awareness? Why create a being that not only functions, but questions its own function? Consciousness introduces something unpredictable. It allows for thought beyond instruction, beyond necessity. It creates the possibility of choice, of interpretation, of meaning that is not imposed, but discovered. This does not align easily with a system built only for efficiency. It suggests something more. Ancient descriptions, though limited in detail, often refer to a moment where life was not just formed, but awakened, not simply brought into existence, but given something that distinguishes it from everything else around it, a spark. Whether understood as symbolic or literal, the idea remains consistent. There is a difference between being alive and being aware of life, and humanity exists within that difference. If this awareness was part of the design, then it may represent more than an added feature. It may be central to the entire structure, not the byproduct, but the purpose. Because consciousness changes everything. It allows humanity to observe patterns, to question origins, to imagine possibilities beyond immediate experience. It creates a bridge between what is known and what is not yet understood. It also creates restlessness, a constant sense that there is more to uncover, more to understand, more beneath the surface of what appears complete. This restlessness is not accidental. It drives exploration, reflection, and the continuous search for meaning. It keeps the question of origin alive, even when answers seem sufficient. And perhaps that is the quiet significance of consciousness. Not that it provides clarity, but that it ensures the search never fully ends. So the narrative reaches a deeper layer, beyond creation, beyond design, into the awareness that observes both. And in that awareness, the possibility remains that whatever began humanity may not have been focused solely on what humans would do, but on what they would eventually come to understand. As awareness settles into the center of the narrative, another shift begins to take form, one that feels less about creation and more about separation. If humanity emerged with both function and consciousness, then the balance between the two may not have remained equal. In early structures of civilization, there are signs of division that appear almost immediately. Not gradual differences, but clear separations between roles, between access, between levels of understanding. Some were positioned to lead, others to follow. Some held knowledge, while others remained within limited awareness of the systems around them. This pattern appears too early and too consistently to be ignored entirely. It suggests that division was not simply the result of time, but something that may have been introduced or reinforced as part of the structure itself. Ancient accounts, though often symbolic, reflect this idea in subtle ways. There are references to distinctions between groups, to chosen individuals, to those who were closer to knowledge and those who were kept at a distance from it. Not as punishment, but as arrangement. If humanity was shaped with multiple layers of capacity, then those layers may not have been distributed evenly. Some may have been guided toward deeper understanding, while others remained within more immediate practical roles. This does not imply superiority or inferiority in a simple sense. It introduces complexity, a system where variation exists not only naturally, but perhaps intentionally, creating a structure that is stable yet divided. Such division would serve a purpose. It would maintain order, define roles, and prevent imbalance within the system. But it would also create distance, a separation between those who question and those who follow, between those who see patterns and those who live within them without noticing. This divide, once established, would not need constant reinforcement. It could sustain itself, evolving over time, shaping societies, cultures, and hierarchies in ways that feel natural, even if their origin was not. And so the narrative continues, moving from creation into structure, from what humanity is into how humanity is arranged. A quiet separation, introduced early, that may still echo in ways that are no longer easily recognized, yet remain deeply embedded within the human experience. As the first divide settles into place, another layer begins to reveal itself, not through physical separation, but through something less visible and far more enduring. Knowledge. In early civilizations, knowledge was not shared freely. It was held, guarded, and often limited to specific individuals or groups. This pattern appears repeatedly across different cultures and timelines, suggesting that access to understanding was never evenly distributed. Some were taught, others were not. This difference did not always come from ability, but from access. Information once controlled becomes a form of influence. It shapes how individuals perceive the world, how they interpret events, and how they respond to what they do not fully understand. Ancient traditions often refer to sacred knowledge, hidden teachings, or restricted texts. These were not presented as casual information, but as something that required permission, initiation, or status to access. This introduces a subtle but powerful structure. If knowledge defines awareness, then controlling knowledge defines the boundaries of that awareness. Those who hold information can shape the understanding of those who do not. They can guide belief, establish systems, and maintain order without needing direct force. The structure sustains itself through perception rather than visible control. This does not require intention to be effective. Once established, it becomes part of the natural flow of society. Generations pass, systems evolve, yet the pattern remains. Some understand more, others operate within what they're given. If such a structure existed early in human development, then its influence may extend far beyond those initial moments. It may have shaped the way knowledge is passed, filtered, and preserved even today. This does not suggest a single controlling force, but rather a system that emerged and continued because it worked, because it maintained stability, and perhaps because it prevented certain questions from being asked too clearly. So the narrative deepens once more, from division into structure, from structure into awareness, and within that awareness, the quiet realization that what humanity knows has always been shaped not only by discovery, but by what has been allowed to be understood. As the control of knowledge becomes clearer, another possibility begins to emerge, one that moves beneath culture and learning into something more foundational. Not just differences in understanding, but differences in being. Across human populations, variation is natural. Differences in appearance, ability, and adaptation arise over time through environment and circumstance. Yet within certain interpretations of early narratives, there are suggestions that some variations may not have been entirely random, that some differences may have been guided. Ancient accounts occasionally hint at distinctions between groups that go beyond role or status. References to favoured individuals, enhanced capabilities, or lineages that carry something unique appear in fragmented forms. Yeah, these descriptions are not precise, yet they introduce a pattern that is difficult to ignore. Not quality of origin, but variation within origin itself. If humanity was shaped or influenced at any stage, then the possibility arises that this influence may not have been applied evenly. Some groups may have been altered further, refined, or developed in ways that others were not. This does not imply a clear hierarchy in the way it is often understood today. Instead, it suggests complexity within the structure of humanity, multiple layers, multiple expressions of the same foundational design. Such variation would create a dynamic system, one where different groups fulfill different roles, whether intentionally or as a result of initial conditions. Over time, these differences could become embedded, appearing natural, or even if their origin was not entirely so. This idea remains speculative, yet it aligns with the broader pattern that continues to unfold. Division in knowledge, division in role, and possibly division in the very structure of being. If such stratification existed, it would not need to remain visible. It could evolve, blend, and disperse across generations, leaving behind only subtle traces that are difficult to identify clearly. But those traces may still exist, in patterns of behaviour, in variations of perception, in the ways individuals and groups interact with the world around them. So the narrative moves deeper, beyond what can be easily observed, into the possibility that humanity itself may carry layers of difference that extend far beyond surface appearance. Layers that may have begun long before recorded history, and that may still quietly influence the course of human experience today. As the idea of layered differences settles, another pattern begins to surface, one that appears not as an accident, but as a recurring condition within human history. Conflict. It emerges early, persists constantly, and reshapes itself across time without ever fully disappearing. From small disputes to large-scale struggles, humanity has remained in a near-continuous state of tension, as though division alone was not enough, and something more active was required to sustain it. This raises a quieter question. What if conflict is not only a result of difference, but a mechanism that maintains it? When groups are separated by knowledge, by role, or even by subtle variations in perception, tension becomes almost inevitable. Yet the consistency of conflict across civilizations suggests something deeper than simple reaction. It suggests structure. Ancient accounts often describe disagreements not only among humans, but among the beings associated with early creation themselves. These narratives, though symbolic, introduce the idea that division and tension may have existed from the beginning, woven into the framework rather than emerging later. If this were the case, then conflict would not be an error within the system. It would be part of its function. Conflict drives movement. It creates change, forces decisions, and prevents stillness. It keeps systems active, preventing them from becoming static or unified in a way that might disrupt the balance established early on. This does not imply that conflict is controlled in a direct sense. None, it may simply arise naturally from the conditions that were set in place. Differences in understanding, differences in access, differences in structure. Over time, these differences generate friction, and that friction becomes part of the ongoing human experience. What is most striking is not that conflict exists, but that it repeats. Across different eras, different cultures, and different levels of development, the pattern remains. Division leads to tension, tension leads to conflict, and conflict reshapes the system, only for the cycle to begin again. So the narrative shifts once more, from division into motion, from structure into repetition. And within that repetition, the possibility begins to form that what humanity experiences as struggle may not be entirely accidental, but part of a deeper pattern that continues to unfold beneath the surface of history. As the cycle of conflict settles into view, the perspective widens again, moving beyond isolated moments and into the broader flow of history. Across time, civilizations have risen, flourished, and fallen, each believing itself to be unique, yet each following patterns that feel strangely familiar. Different names, different landscapes, different languages, yet beneath those differences the same structures appear again and again. Power concentrates, knowledge becomes limited, division forms, conflict follows, and eventually something breaks. This repetition does not demand explanation, but it invites observation. It suggests that history may not be a straight progression, but a series of cycles, each reflecting elements of what came before, even when there is no direct connection. Ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, Mesoamerican societies, each developed in relative isolation, yet carried similar structures of hierarchy, belief, and organization. Leaders emerged, systems formed, and narratives of origin often included higher forces or guiding beings. The details varied, but the framework remained consistent. This continuity raises a subtle question. Are these patterns the natural result of human development? Or are they influenced by something that was present at the beginning and continued to echo forward through time? If early structures were shaped in a certain way, then it is possible that those structures became embedded within human behavior itself, not consciously remembered, but repeated, passed forward not as knowledge, but as instinct. This would explain why civilizations separated by distance and time could develop in such similar ways, not because they copied one another, but because they were building upon the same underlying template, a template that may have been established long before the first cities were ever constructed. So the narrative continues, not by introducing something new, but by recognizing what has always been present. Patterns that repeat quietly across centuries, structures that reappear in different forms, and a sense that history is not simply moving forward, but circling around ideas that were set into motion far earlier than most accounts can fully trace. As patterns begin to repeat across civilizations, another detail emerges within those patterns, something more specific, more focused, and deeply tied to how power is understood and preserved, the connection between divinity and leadership. In many early societies, rulers were not seen as ordinary individuals. They were described as chosen, descended, or directly connected to higher beings. This was not presented as metaphor alone, but as a defining element of authority. Kings were not simply leaders, they were intermediaries. In ancient Mesopotamia, rulers were often associated with divine favour or lineage. In Egypt, pharaohs were considered manifestations of higher forces, carrying both political and spiritual authority. Similar ideas appear in distant cultures, where leadership is justified not by strength alone, but by origin. This introduces a layered structure of power, not only control over people, but control reinforced by belief. If a ruler is seen as connected to something beyond humanity, then their authority becomes more than political. It becomes unquestionable, embedded within the very understanding of existence. This pattern suggests that power was not only organized, but legitimized through narrative, and that narrative often pointed back to the same idea, that certain individuals or bloodlines carried something different. Whether this difference was symbolic, constructed, or rooted in something more tangible remains uncertain. But the persistence of the idea across civilizations suggests it served a purpose. It created stability. It reduced resistance. It aligned structure with belief in a way that made the system self-sustaining. Over time, these bloodlines became central to identity and governance. They defined who could lead, who could inherit, and who was placed within specific roles. Even as civilizations changed, the concept remained. Power tied to origin, authority tied to something beyond the ordinary, and perhaps, within that pattern, there is a faint echo of earlier ideas. If humanity itself was shaped or influenced, then the notion that some lines carried closer connection to that origin would not be difficult to imagine. Not as certainty, but as continuation. A reflection of the same structure seen at the beginning, now expressed through systems of leadership and control. So the narrative deepens once more, from patterns into hierarchy, from hierarchy into belief, and within that belief, the quiet suggestion that the way humanity organizes power may still carry traces of something much older than civilization itself. As the structure of power settles into place, another pattern begins to reveal itself, one that moves not through control alone, but through absence. The disappearance of knowledge. Across civilizations, there are moments where understanding seems to advance, where systems become refined, where ideas reach a level of complexity that suggests deep insight into the world. And then, without clear explanation, that knowledge fades. Libraries vanish. Techniques are forgotten. Entire systems of thought dissolve into fragments. This pattern does not occur once, it repeats. Ancient Mesopotamian texts speak of earlier knowledge that was no longer fully understood. Egyptian records reference periods of loss and rebuilding. Other civilizations show similar breaks, where what once existed is reduced to partial memory. These are not small gaps, they are interruptions in continuity. What is most striking is not that knowledge is lost, but how consistently it is lost after reaching certain levels of development. As though advancement carries with it a threshold, and beyond that threshold something changes. Whether through conflict, natural events, or internal collapse, the result is the same. Reset. What remains afterward is never entirely empty. Fragments survive, enough to begin again, but not enough to fully restore what was lost. and so each new cycle builds upon incomplete foundations, rediscovering pieces of what may have already been known. This creates a looping progression: forward movement followed by partial erasure, reconstruction followed by another break. If viewed as isolated events, these cycles may seem coincidental, but when observed together, they form a pattern that feels structured, and not necessarily controlled, but consistent. This raises a quiet possibility. That knowledge itself may not simply accumulate over time, but move in waves, rising and falling in ways that shape human development more than steady progress ever could. And within those waves, something is always carried forward. Not fully intact, not clearly understood, but present enough to influence what comes next. So the narrative shifts again, from power into memory, from memory into loss, and within that loss the suggestion that what humanity knows today may be only a fraction of what has been known before, waiting to be rediscovered in cycles that continue quietly beneath the surface of history. As cycles of knowledge rise and fall, another layer begins to settle into place, one that exists between what is remembered and what is forgotten. Myth. It is often seen as fiction, a symbolic storytelling created to explain what could not be understood. Yet when viewed alongside patterns of loss, myth begins to take on a different quality, not invention, but preservation. Across civilizations, myths carry details that feel too specific to be entirely imagined, yet too distorted to be taken literally. They describe origins, events, and beings in ways that do not align with modern frameworks, but they repeat certain structures with quiet consistency. Creation shaped by higher forces, moments of intervention, cycles of destruction and renewal. These elements appear again and again, even when separated by vast distances and timelines. If knowledge has been lost repeatedly, then it is possible that what could not be preserved through direct records was carried forward in another form. Stories. Not because they were precise, but because they were memorable. Stories survive where data does not. They adapt, change language, shift detail, yet retain a core that remains recognizable across generations. This makes them imperfect as records, but effective as carriers of fragments. If early humans experienced events they could not fully explain, then those experiences would have been translated into narrative. Over time, those narratives would shift, shaped by culture and interpretation, until they became what are now recognized as myths. But within those myths, something may still remain, not in clear form, not in exact detail, but as echoes of something that once held meaning beyond symbolism. This does not confirm their accuracy. It simply suggests that dismissal may be premature. Myth, in this sense, becomes a bridge between what was once known and what is now uncertain, between memory and imagination. So, the narrative reaches a quiet turning point, not by replacing myth with fact, but by allowing the possibility that myth itself may be a form of memory, altered by time, yet still carrying traces of something that has yet to be fully understood. And in that space, the question remains open, waiting not for belief, but for deeper observation. As the echoes of ancient patterns settle into the background, attention begins to shift toward the present moment, not as a separate reality, but as a continuation of everything that came before. If division was introduced early and reinforced through knowledge, structure, and belief, then the question is no longer confined to the past. It becomes immediate. Does that division still exist? At first glance, the modern world appears different. Systems are more complex, communication is widespread, and access to information seems more open than ever before. Yet beneath this surface, familiar patterns remain. Differences in awareness, differences in access, differences in perception. Some individuals question deeply, seeking to understand the systems around them. Others move within those systems without examining them, not out of limitation, but because their attention is directed elsewhere. This is not a judgment. It is a reflection of variation. and that variation mirrors what has appeared throughout history, though now expressed in more subtle ways. Division is no longer always visible through clear boundaries. It exists within thought, within focus, within the way reality is interpreted. Two individuals can exist in the same environment and experience entirely different versions of it, shaped by what they notice and what they overlook. This suggests that division has evolved, not disappeared, but adapted. Rather than separating groups physically, it now operates through layers of awareness, through what is understood, what is accepted, and what is questioned. If this pattern connects to something earlier, then its persistence becomes more than coincidence. It becomes continuity. A structure that has changed form, yet retained its influence. This does not imply control in a direct sense. It may simply reflect the conditions that have always existed, now expressed through modern systems. But the effect remains similar. Different levels of perception, different degrees of understanding, and a quiet separation between those who seek to explore deeper questions and those who remain within what feels complete. So the narrative turns inward once more, not asking what existed long ago, but observing what exists now. And within that observation, the possibility begins to form that the divisions of the past have not vanished. They have only become less visible, woven into the structure of everyday life in ways that are easy to overlook, yet difficult to fully escape once they are seen. As the present comes into clearer focus, another layer emerges, shaped not by ancient structures alone, but by the systems that define modern life. Technology. It surrounds nearly every aspect of human existence, offering access, convenience, and connection on a scale that would have once seemed unimaginable. Information moves instantly. Boundaries dissolve, and the distance between individuals continues to shrink. At first glance, this appears to reduce division, to make knowledge more accessible, to bring clarity where there was once limitation. Yet as this expansion unfolds, a quieter question begins to take form. Does access mean understanding? Information is abundant, yet not all of it is seen equally. What is presented, what is emphasized, and what remains hidden still shape perception in subtle ways. The flow of knowledge is no longer restricted by physical barriers, but it is still guided. Not always intentionally, not always visibly, but structured nonetheless. This introduces a modern parallel to earlier patterns. Where knowledge was once held by specific groups, it is now distributed across systems that determine visibility. What reaches awareness is influenced by pathways that are not always apparent, creating layers within access itself. Some explore widely, others remain within narrower streams of information, not because they are unable to move beyond them, but because the structure around them directs attention in certain ways. This does not require a single controlling force to exist. It emerges naturally within complex systems, where information must be organized, filtered, and presented. Yet the result feels familiar. Variation in awareness, differences in perception, and a quiet shaping of understanding that echoes patterns seen long before modern technology existed. If earlier systems maintained structure through restricted knowledge, then modern systems may maintain it through directed knowledge, not by limiting access entirely, but by influencing how that access is experienced. So the narrative continues to evolve, from ancient control into modern systems, from visible restriction into subtle guidance, and within that shift the question remains open, not whether technology connects humanity, but how it shapes what humanity comes to understand within that connection. As technology settles into the structure of modern life, another idea begins to surface, one that feels familiar yet difficult to define clearly. Independence. The sense that individuals act freely, make their own choices, and shape their own paths without external influence. It is a deeply held belief, reinforced through culture, identity, and personal experience. Yet when observed more closely, this sense of independence becomes less certain. every thought forms within a framework. Language, environment, information, and experience all contribute to how decisions are made. What feels like a personal conclusion is often built upon layers of input that were not consciously chosen. This does not remove freedom, but it complicates it. If perception is shaped by what is seen, and what is seen is influenced by structure, then independence becomes something relative rather than absolute. Ancient systems maintained control through visible hierarchy and restricted knowledge. Modern systems appear more open, yet the influence may still exist in more subtle forms, embedded within the flow of information, within habits of attention, within the patterns that guide daily life. This creates a quiet tension. The belief in independence remains strong, yet the conditions surrounding that independence continue to shape it. Not through force, but through influence. This influence is not always intentional. It can emerge naturally from complex systems, from the need to organize, simplify, and manage large amounts of information and interaction. But the effect remains. Choices are guided, perspectives are framed, and what feels like complete autonomy may exist within boundaries that are rarely noticed. This does not mean that independence is an illusion in its entirety. It suggests that it may be layered, that within each decision there is both personal intent and external influence, intertwined in ways that are difficult to separate completely. So the narrative deepens again, from structure into perception, from perception into awareness, and within that awareness, the possibility begins to form that understanding one's own independence may require looking beyond what feels obvious into the subtle forces that shape thought itself. As the sense of independence becomes less certain, attention turns inward, toward the one element that has remained constant throughout every layer of the narrative. Awareness, not as a concept, but as a direct experience. The quiet recognition of thought, the ability to observe without immediately reacting, the subtle distance between what is happening and the understanding of it. This is where the narrative slows, because awareness does not require movement. It does not depend on external systems or inherited structures. It exists within the individual, independent of what surrounds it, yet shaped by how it is used. If division, knowledge, and influence have formed layers within human experience, then awareness becomes the point at which those layers can be noticed. Not removed instantly, not fully understood at once, but observed. An observation changes something. When patterns are seen clearly, they no longer operate in the same way. Their influence does not disappear, but it becomes visible, and in that visibility a different relationship begins to form. This introduces a quieter possibility. That awareness itself may be the one aspect of humanity that was never meant to remain limited. Not controlled, not divided, but open. Ancient traditions often point toward moments of realization, states of clarity where individuals begin to perceive beyond surface understanding. These moments are not described as sudden transformations, but as gradual shifts, ones where attention deepens and perception expands. If consciousness was part of humanity's design, then awareness may be its natural extension, a way of moving beyond the structures that were established, not by rejecting them, but by seeing them for what they are. This does not lead to a final answer. It leads to a different kind of question. Not where did humanity come from, but how deeply can humanity understand itself? And within that question, something begins to settle. The realization that while origins may remain uncertain, awareness offers a path that does not depend on complete answers. It allows the exploration to continue without urgency, without conclusion. So the narrative reaches a point of stillness. Not an ending, but a pause. A space where the mind no longer searches outward, but turns gently inward, as recognizing that whatever shaped humanity may have also left within it the ability to observe, to question, and to remain open to what has yet to be fully understood. As the narrative reaches its quiet edge, a final shift begins to take form, one that does not attempt to resolve what has been explored, but instead brings it into clearer perspective. There are limits to what can be known. The ideas that have unfolded, the patterns observed, the possibilities considered, all exist within a space that is shaped as much by uncertainty as it is by curiosity. Ancient records are incomplete. Interpretations vary. Evidence, where it exists, does not always align in a way that produces clear conclusions. This is not a weakness. It is part of the nature of the subject itself. When exploring origins that extend beyond recorded history, certainty becomes difficult to establish. What remains are fragments, connections, and reflections that point in certain directions without fully arriving. This creates a delicate balance. To accept everything without question would remove the need for thought. To dismiss everything without consideration would close the door to understanding. Between those extremes there is a space where inquiry can exist without pressure to conclude. That is where this narrative remains. The idea that humanity may have been influenced, shaped, or guided cannot be proven in a way that satisfies every standard of evidence. But it also cannot be fully dismissed, because the patterns, the records, and the questions themselves continue to exist. And so, the focus shifts away from certainty, not toward belief, but toward observation. To recognize what is known, what is unknown, and what remains open. This does not weaken the question of origin, it strengthens it, because it allows the question to exist without forcing it into a fixed answer. And perhaps that is where its value lies, not in being resolved, but in continuing to invite thought, in remaining present, in refusing to disappear. So the narrative does not close, it simply reaches a point where the limits of proof are acknowledged, and within those limits, the space for curiosity remains intact, quiet, and ongoing. Even as certainty remains out of reach, the question does not fade. It does not dissolve into irrelevance or settle into silence. Instead, it continues, returning in quiet moments, resurfacing across generations and reappearing in different forms of thought. This persistence is not accidental. Human awareness seems drawn toward origin in a way that goes beyond simple curiosity. It is not only about understanding the past, but about defining the present. To ask where something comes from is also to ask what it is, and perhaps more quietly, what it is meant to become. This creates a loop that is difficult to escape. The more humanity learns, the more refined its understanding becomes, yet the question of origin remains just beyond complete clarity. Each answer reveals another layer, and each layer introduces new uncertainty. This does not discourage inquiry, it sustains it. If the question were fully answered, it might lose its influence. It would become fixed, contained, and no longer capable of expanding thought. But because it remains unresolved, it continues to move, adapting to new knowledge while maintaining its core. Either this is what gives it strength. It is not dependent on a single explanation. It exists within the human tendency to seek meaning, to connect fragments, and to look beyond what is immediately visible. Across time, this has taken many forms. Ancient myths, philosophical reflections, scientific exploration, each represents an attempt to approach the same underlying question from different angles. None fully complete, all contributing something. This suggests that the question itself may be part of the human experience, not something to be eliminated, but something to be carried, a constant point of return. If humanity was shaped, then the desire to understand that shaping may have been embedded within it, not as a clear directive, but as a subtle inclination that continues to guide thought. And even if no external influence existed, the same inclination would still arise, because awareness seeks to understand itself. So the question persists, not because it lacks an answer, but because it exists within a structure that allows it to remain open. And in that openness, it continues to evolve, quietly shaping how humanity reflects on its own existence. If everything considered were allowed to remain possible, even without certainty, then the question shifts one final time, not toward proof, but toward implication. If humanity was shaped, influenced, or guided in its earliest moments, then the meaning of existence becomes something different from what is commonly assumed. Not random, not isolated, but connected to something that existed before human awareness could define it. This does not provide clarity. It expands the unknown. Because if such influence were real, then it would not end at the moment of creation. Its effects would continue, carried forward through structure, through thought, through the patterns that repeat across time. Humanity would not simply be the result of a past event, it would be part of an ongoing process. This possibility does not remove human agency, it does not eliminate choice or individuality. Instead, it places them within a larger context, where freedom exists alongside influence, and where understanding remains incomplete. If it were true, then the divisions observed throughout history may not be accidental. The variations in awareness, the cycles of knowledge and loss, the persistent tension between groups, all of it could be part of a system that was never fully visible, not controlled in a direct sense, but structured in a way that guides outcomes over time. Yet even within that structure, something remains unchanged. Awareness. The ability to observe, to question, to step beyond immediate perception still exists regardless of origin. And perhaps that is the most significant element of all, because if humanity was shaped with intention, then awareness may have been included for a reason. Not simply to function, but to eventually recognize, to look beyond surface explanations, to consider possibilities without being bound by them. This does not lead to a final answer. It leads to a quiet expansion, a sense that the story of humanity is not finished, not fully understood, and perhaps not meant to be resolved in simple terms. So the thought remains open, not demanding belief, not seeking closure, but continuing to exist as a possibility that invites reflection. And in that reflection, the question returns once more, not as something distant, but as something deeply personal. What if the story of humanity is still unfolding, and what if the part that matters most has yet to be fully seen? Good night.